September 2nd, 2020, just before dawn, Washington, D.C.'s Anacostia neighborhood. A gas station clerk opens for business after working the graveyard shift.
We're 24/7, 365. We run 24 hours. My employees work in a enclosed glass bulletproof booth, and the stores are locked overnight. My employee, Mustafa, was outside the booth. It's the beginning of the day when he has regular customers that come in for coffee. He's checking shelves, checking cleanliness. When he sees the customer come up, and he unlocks the door with his remote, and the customer comes in.
I opened around 6 o'clock. I was about to open the door anyhow, but I saw that the person outside, and he saw the door is locked. Then he was going back. I thought they are in need, so I just opened the door. He didn't look dangerous, and because of the pandemic, everyone has the mask on. He come inside, he just walk around to the cooler.
As the man slowly walks to get a drink, two of his friends come up to the door. Mustafa buzzes them in too, with no idea of how much danger he's just put himself in.
There was kids. They are about like 20 to 22, I guess. I was not nervous to let them in.
So the other two guys walk in, and what's strange is they don't even look around the store. They just walk to the front.
Mustafa has full control of all the doors.
The door is electronic, automatic lock. I have the remote all the time.
So Mustafa opens the door to go in the back.
But that's when something terrifying happens.
He gets rushed by the three customers, and the original customer pulls a gun out of his hoodie and points it right at Mustafa's face.
He was like, give me the money, show me the money, where's the money? And he said, I will shoot you.
As the store's security cameras record everything, Mustafa desperately tries to fight the robbers off, blocking them with his body.
When they rush Mustafa, they're screaming at him, "Where are the gloves?" Which is the most bizarre statement I've ever heard. They're asking for gloves so that they don't have fingerprints all over the place.
I was trying to do my best, to stop them, because I have two things in my mind, that this gun can be real or can be fake.
He's very tense, he's very nervous, he's very afraid at this point.
I am a good believer on God, So I was like, okay, if something is gonna happen, then I am not the one who can stop this thing. But I will try my best to, whatever I can do.
You can see fear in his eyes as he's backing up with a gun in his face.
But the gunman doesn't fire. Instead, he uses his gun to attack Mustafa.
He hit me on my head, and I was bleeding. I think maybe I'm gonna die.
That's when one of the robbers, who is armed with a crowbar, rushes over to the front door.
He tried to go outside, and he found the door is locked. Then he started shouting, the door is locked.
He actually, when he sees the door locked, he puts the crowbar into the door and tries to jimmy the door.
Then the guy who had a gun with him, he go over there.
So while the two geniuses with the weapons are trying to open the front door, Mustafa is left with the one guy that has no weapon.
So when I thought that, okay, if they don't have any weapons with them, I can fight with them, right? So I was trying to keep him so that I can close the door. I'm trying to fight him so that he can get scared.
To Mustafa's relief, his strategy works.
Then he moved back. Then I locked myself in.
Mustafa gets in the booth and he locks the door, and he's immediately calling 911.
911, what is your emergency?
I just grabbed the phone, and I'm sure that they know that I was trying to call the police.
The three robbers are stuck inside. You can see the panic in their movements. And as they're running back and forth to the door and to the booth, there's no plan. It's a scary thing to watch. You just don't know what's going to happen. Nothing good can come out of this.
Only bulletproof glass stands between Mustafa and his attackers. who are desperately trying to get out.
They was trying to break the door. Then the one who had a rod with him, he put the rod in between the doors, and he was trying to break it.
They've lost all of their power.
They're pulling on the door as hard as they can.
The frustrated robbers try to get back into the booth, where Mustafa has safely locked himself in.
They tried to come inside to get the remote to unlock the door. They was trying to break the door. Then they was kind of scared too. They are just trying to escape the store. They was not confident. Maybe they don't have that kind of experience in this things.
Once Mustafa locks the door, there's nothing left for the robbers to do. They just need to get out and get away. With a gun, this is a serious crime. This is instant jail time. You had to get out. If not, they were going to go to jail.
They're begging and pleading to get out of here. Open this door. If you don't open this door right now. And in their anger, one of them even tries to open the door so hard that he rips the handle off.
They pull so hard that the handle pops off the door. That's a lot of strength to pull on the door and have it pop off a door. I mean, it's a bolt he had to break. The robber then falls backwards. It's kind of humorous looking at it. They're still pulling.
What the robbers fail to realize is that if they would just stop pulling, they might actually have some luck.
This is a push door. A magnet lock is holding the door. And magnet locks are not that strong. You put enough pressure on it, it will just pop open. But they pull the door. They're pulling on the door when it's a push.
With the robbers apparently stuck, their accomplice, who is sitting outside in the getaway car, tries to come to their rescue.
The other guys, he shouted on the other guy who was waiting outside. He said, "Bring the car, bring the car."
So our three robbers are banging, screaming, and pleading on the door to get out. And their partner on the other side in the car now realizes they're trapped and he's got to do something.
What happens next is shocking.
He jumps the curb, and then the door gets pushed open.
As soon as this car plows through, it barely even opens the two doors. The three of them narrowly escape, trying to inch their way in between this little sliver.
Police arrive within 5 minutes. The robbers have already escaped, but don't realize they've left behind a very critical piece of evidence.
That license plate peeked right through the doors.
A few days later, a Prince George's County, Maryland detective called me who had heard about the attempted robbery, and it was very similar to several incidents they had in his jurisdiction. And he asked if he could come see the video. At that point, we saw the license plate, and they had everything they needed.
Police used the license plate to track down and arrest the robbers. At least 2 of them are juveniles. They suspect they're responsible for a string of similar burglaries.
They hit stores and hurt clerks in stores that did not have booths because there was no protection. The only reason I sleep at night is that my night guys are inside of a booth, a bulletproof glass booth.
The video of the robbery gone wrong prompts people to mock them on social media.
This is the instructional video of what not to do if you're trying to rob a place. This is everything you shouldn't do. And probably don't use your getaway car with an exposed license plate as a battering ram.
Mustafa doesn't understand why the robbers would go to so much trouble for so little money.
I had an experience before. If somebody come to rob, they just come inside, they grab candies, they grab sodas, and they just try to run. Never thought about that. They are trying to come inside the booth for cash. It doesn't make sense. For $500-600, you're trying to kill somebody.
To be sure it never happens again, everyone at the gas station now lives by what they call the Mustafa rule.
The Mustafa rule is don't leave the booth when people are in your store at night by yourself. One little mistake, and that little mistake in just a few seconds could have ended very, very badly.
I think I'm never gonna do that again. You never know what's going on someone's mind. So I feel lucky to be alive.
In Massachusetts, another store clerk is also counting his blessings. Thursday, December 3rd, 2019, Newton, Massachusetts. It's the middle of the day and business as usual at this corner mini-mart.
Thank you.
Good day.
Bye-bye.
Only the cashier, Charlie Patel, and one of his regular customers are inside the store when suddenly all hell breaks loose. A masked, armed robber storms into the store.
Hello, this is the 911 operator. What's going on?
What is up? Armed robbery.
Yeah, armed robbery, okay.
This robber decides to rob a convenience store, which is literally a 3-minute walk from a police station.
The robber is wearing a hoodie and wielding a knife, and he charges straight towards Charlie.
You hand the knife, open the register. Open the register. Oh my God.
Terrified, Charlie unlocks the cash drawer.
Charlie does a great job of giving the guy what he wants and then backing away into his safety. If he had yelled or screamed for help, this guy could have freaked out and stabbed him and maybe done something even worse.
But what the thief doesn't realize is that there's also a customer in the store. And this isn't just any customer, it's a police officer who sees everything.
The rob guy, see police officer car, and he understand is next street is police station.
At first, I thought it might have been someone joking around, and then Charlie was looking at me like, what is this guy doing? And then I saw him, he had a knife in his hand, and he was yelling at Charlie, give me the money. And then I'm like, this is for real.
But the lieutenant quickly sees a window of opportunity because the thief is so fixated on getting his cash.
He take the money, just like, see outside. You only for register, take the money.
He still did not know I was standing there.
This is a bold move. Cops are in and out of this market all day. This guy doesn't check for cameras, doesn't check for other customers, and just beelines it towards the register. This is a textbook disorganized crime.
So that's when Dave gets right in the robber's face.
And that's when I drew my firearm, and I had the gun by my side, and he had the knife in his hand.
I saved my life.
He was looking at me, and he was like, help me.
You see him draw his weapon and walk right up to the counter and just look at the guy. What are you doing, buddy?
And I was standing right across from the suspect. It happened so fast, I think I just reacted. I just zeroed in on him and told him, drop the knife, drop the knife.
Then, the thief suddenly tries to make a run for it. But Dave manages to grab onto him.
And then we started wrestling around the store. Charlie jumped in, he was trying to help me subdue him. We were knocking over display cases, and I was trying to handcuff him and place him under arrest.
During the altercation, he's unable to holster his gun.
My gun had fallen. I was trying to reholster, and I was trying to hold him back with one hand. I had the gun in the other hand, and when he started fighting, I couldn't get it back in the holster, and at some point, it fell behind the counter.
So the risk of the officer kind of tossing his weapon off to the side as he's struggling with the thief is that if this thief breaks loose, he could get hold of that weapon. And now we're going to have a whole host of other problems happening here.
Now, things are really scary. Dave is unarmed, and he doesn't know what this thief is capable of.
So we know that the thief already has a knife, but we also don't know if he has other weapons on him.
I wasn't able to call on the radio or my phone. I was yelling to Charlie to call 911.
Charlie dials for help, but he's so scared he can't even talk.
I said, you talk to police station. I shaking.
I was struggling with the suspect. He held the phone up to my mouth, and I yelled into the phone who I was, where I was, and that we needed help.
Hello, this is the 911 operator. What's going on?
Police help! Armed robbery!
Robbery, okay. Is there a gun?
Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, we're on the way, sir. Tell me what he looks like.
Go fast!
We're on the way. Tell me what he looks like. Is he still there?
It's Lieutenant Tempesta. Armenia trying to arrest him.
On the way, Temp.
For Dave and Charlie, the next few minutes are absolutely terrifying.
What if backup never arrives and then something bad happens?
For Lieutenant Dave Tempesta, a 37-year veteran of the Newton Police Force, this is personal.
I've known Charlie probably about 15 years, and we've become friends. That day, like every other day on the way to work, I always stop and get a coffee, and then I stop by the store, and I usually bring Charlie the coffee also. Small, extra cream, extra sugar.
When the robbery first unfolds, Dave isn't even paying attention.
I bought a lottery ticket, and then I stepped back to the back of the store.
But the moment he realizes his friend is in trouble, he jumps into action.
I don't know if my guard was down, but it sure went up quick when that guy came in the store to rob it. It was adrenaline.
And now, as he waits for backup to arrive,
We're on the way.
he's in a dangerous struggle. Scared and not sure how to help, Charlie desperately tries to get assistance from outside the store.
I open the door. I told the customer, come here, give me help.
Two customers enter the store and try to barricade the door. It is a full-on fight.
At one point, he had made it to the exit door. Both Charlie and I were yelling to them to help us, and they were helping hold on to him.
Oh my God. We flew down 2 times.
In the midst of the frenzy, the thief's hoodie comes off and his face is finally revealed.
It was like a stocking hat, and he had a hood over that, and during the struggle, that had come off.
And finally, after 5 long minutes, Lieutenant Tempesta and the 3 other men are able to subdue him.
They were helping hold on to him, and at the same time, backup units arrived.
Responding officers promptly arrest the thief, who seems confused about who thwarted his plan.
He's asking the cops who arrived whether or not the officer in the store was a real cop or not.
For law enforcement, this was right place, right time. But for this guy, it was the wrong place and the worst time.
The would-be thief is identified as 30-year-old Thomas Zikos.
He was not known to us. He did not live in the area here.
Investigators say Zikos told them he's struggling with addiction.
Zikos pleads not guilty to charges of armed robbery, assault, battery on a police officer, and resisting arrest. He's still awaiting trial. Lieutenant Tempesta is just glad he was in the store when Zikos tried to rob it.
Charlie started hugging me, and he was so appreciative. With the both of us, I don't think we could believe what happened.
He saved my life. Oh, thank you, thank God. My granddaughter and my family is grandpa. Oh, God, you're Rob, you saved your life, grandpa. He every day scared.
I look at it sometimes, and I don't believe that's me there. I'm like, why did this happen?
The video of Lieutenant Tempesta saving the day makes big news, and he is hailed as a hero.
This officer just looking to play the lottery becomes a hero, turning the tables on an armed robber in Newton. Lieutenant Dave Tempesta saw the holdup happening from the back of the convenience store, and he jumped in to stop it.
I got calls from friends in Florida, and they said they seen me on TV, and I'm like, what are you talking about? I had no idea. The mayor had a ceremony and presented both Charlie and I with a plaque of appreciation. It was really nice. I received a commemorative coin from the chief of police, which they give to officers that do something that stands out. It made me feel good. I mean, nothing like this ever happened before in my career, and felt like they appreciate me.
And now, this officer and store clerk are bonded for life.
My life changed. Dave is good, my friend, good officer. I just come here and save my life. I thank God. I pray Dave is long life. Me too.
Just made us even closer. Charlie needed help, and I was right there for him, and everything worked out good. It was just not believable what happened.
And new tonight, caught on camera, a neighborhood nightmare in Huntington Beach where a woman is accused of attacking a man with her car.
The disabled man at the center of that fight says the video doesn't show what really happened, but it certainly is catching everyone's attention.
September 7th, 2014. Huntington Beach, California. It's an area record specialist Sarah Heidecker loves.
Huntington Beach is really nice. It's a nice beach town. It's pretty expensive.
Despite the hefty price tags, Sarah has found a friendly, affordable apartment not too far from the beach.
We all kind of got along together. Everyone would talk to each other when we ran into each other.
It's essential to have a good relationship with your neighbors. You tend to look out for one another.
Still, two of the people in the building have a reputation as being neighbors from hell.
My bedroom overlooked the driveway, and I would just hear screaming. Or something getting thrown, or just insanity. And I could hear it loudly over my TV.
The culprits, Bob Ayers and Laura Cox, seem to be fighting all the time.
They're definitely not a functional couple. I don't even know if they were like a couple anymore, but they were at one time. They just lived together.
Don't let me tell Well, hey. I'm sorry if you know what I did.
With that background and that baggage, that probably adds even more intensity to the situations.
Sarah finds the constant screaming so frustrating, she starts recording it.
I started taping these videos so that I could show my friends because they didn't believe me. They were like, no, you don't have crazy neighbors. Like, Huntington Beach is a nice area. What are you talking about? She would be out in her car. She's so frustrated about not being able to find something in her car that she starts kicking her car, leaves giant dents in it.
Essentially, she has no filter. She strikes out, she yells out, uses vulgar language.
It was disrupting for me.
So she is not properly managing her anger. And as a result, it's making living with her unbearable.
And on this Saturday morning, things take a dark turn.
I woke up kind of late, and I just heard the worst screaming I'd heard this entire time. And so I paused the TV, and I went over to my bedroom, and I looked out the window. I was recording it, because that was just kind of what I did at that point.
Calm down and relax.
We see a man on a motorized scooter parked behind some type of vehicle, and it appears to be blocking the vehicle's exit.
Calm down. Shut the motor off for a few. Get the out of my way!
And she was just screaming at him.
You go get scooter!
You could tell he didn't want her to go anywhere. Like, she wasn't in the condition to drive, which was insane because it was like 8 in the morning. It was pretty crazy. I don't know if something had happened before. She was fuming.
This is intense.
Get the out of my way!
But neither Bob or his scooter are budging.
It's clear that he positioned his scooter directly behind her to keep her from leaving. He puts himself at risk so that she doesn't pose a danger to the public.
But she has no interest in calming down.
We see this escalate tremendously. She could do anything at this point.
Get the out of my way!
And then the tension boils over.
She demands that he move the scooter. He refuses.
All of a sudden, she just pushes him over.
Now, clearly, Bob is bigger than her. He's on a scooter that clearly must weigh a couple 100 pounds. And she just shoves that thing over essentially like it's a little tricycle.
She appears to have this rageful, superhuman strength.
She then climbs back in her vehicle and then starts to back up. Now, it's clear that he has some type of physical limitations that require him to use this scooter. She actually strikes the scooter, kind of pushing it to the side. We see pieces fall off of it. We hear the man screaming out.
I didn't think it was gonna get as bad as it did.
Obviously, something serious is about to happen. Is she gonna run him over?
This is out of control. But somehow, Bob manages to get out of the way just in time to avoid catastrophe.
She backs up into the scooter, and it looks as if she's gonna just like run over Bob as well. She breaks the scooter with her car, and you hear him yelling. He's screaming, but she doesn't stop.
I didn't think it was gonna go that far. It was insane to watch.
She is dangerous. She's willing to run over this guy and to break anything and anyone in her path.
He picks up his scooter. He was yelling at her. His scooter still worked. He took off down the street, who knows where.
Laura takes off too, and Sarah and her neighbors race downstairs.
All of us came outside and we all called the cops.
No one is sure where Laura has gone, but when Sarah shows the police her videos, they know they have to find her.
It's clear that she poses a menace, and she needs to be stopped at this point.
I didn't think I was ever gonna have to show them to police. It was like, they need to see that this is happening.
And it doesn't take police long to locate Laura.
They find her down the road, and she's at a liquor store. They determine that she's under the influence, and that kind of pretty much explains her erratic behavior.
She was drunk. So that was what she officially got arrested for.
Laura is charged with driving under the influence. But Bob refuses to press any additional charges.
He was just kind of like, this is just a thing that happened. I don't want to do anything about this. Just let it go.
And that makes Sarah and her neighbors worry that they will never get rid of the neighbors from hell, especially when the building says they won't evict them.
We were all just kind of really worried and then also pretty frustrated that we still had to deal with this.
Sarah is used to seeing fighting, yelling, throwing things. She's not used to seeing near murder. She almost killed him. And for Sarah, that's where the line was crossed.
We didn't want it to keep escalating and something else bad to happen. It was like, I don't want to live like this anymore.
Essentially, at this point, the neighbors have had enough.
Frustrated, Sarah decides to post her videos on social media, and the story goes viral in no time.
Caught on camera and going viral, a violent encounter in Huntington Beach.
It kind of just took off and blew up into this thing.
You can see a woman pushing, then almost running over a man in a motorized scooter.
The violence, which erupted Sunday afternoon in an apartment complex in Huntington Beach,
just craziness,
was captured on camera from her upstairs window.
For a little while after the story goes public, the neighbors do get some much-needed tranquility.
Laura ended up going to jail for about 2 months. So it was pretty quiet for 2 months, except for Bob blaming everything on me. He said that it was my fault she got arrested.
But then, Sarah and her neighbors managed to convince Bob that all they really want is to help him.
I were kind of like, look, Bob, like, we don't have any issues with you. Like, you went through some hell. You're living alone. So if you need help with anything, just give us a call. We'll come down and help you. So he was really nice after that.
Surprisingly, Sarah and Bob actually become friends. And when Laura is released from prison, they all agree to keep the peace.
Sometimes valuable friendships can develop from these traumatic events.
They had to all get together and work it out to resolve this conflict on their own.
And Sarah has learned an important lesson.
If you see something, if a neighbor that needs help, just try to reach out and get them help as best as you can. especially if it's causing an issue for your sanity. Yeah, happy ending was definitely needed.
In Montana, another violent situation leads to troubling questions about the people involved.
Do you know that they say love is blind? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, this couple actually proves it.
April 11th, 2016, Billings, Montana. A frightening armed robbery is underway at a local bar. It's 1:15 in the morning when security cameras at the Tap Inn capture a car pulling up outside. The driver stays in the getaway car while 3 armed robbers march into the bar.
2 males and 1 female. They were covered with bandanas, gloves, long sleeves, and they were armed with semi-automatic weapons. This is a violent crime.
But incredibly, despite the imminent danger, one cozy couple is too busy locking lips to pay any attention.
They were a little tipsy, they were kissing, they were really in the moment with each other.
Even as the thieves unload the cash register, weapons drawn, the kissing couple never even looks up.
Did they not even realize what was going on while they were making out?
This was a very serious situation here. We had an active armed robbery taking place right in front of them.
A whole minute passes by until the oblivious couple finally comes up for air and realizes the place is being robbed. But even then, they don't seem fazed.
Once they realize what's happening around them, you know, these two are just very kind of just laid back, like, wow. Oh, wow, look, there's a robbery.
Whoever this kissing couple is, security cameras show them making out at the bar for a good 45 minutes straight before the robbers march in.
They were totally enamored with one another, and this is like a whole big love fest, and they were just so into each other that they had no idea what was happening.
The thieves get away with about $1,100 cash, some poker machine payout slips, and whatever else they can grab. The shaken bartender calls police.
Billings 911. Yeah, this is the Tap Inn Bar, 910 Broadwater. I just got robbed. All right, I've got 2 officers already headed your way. And the suspect just left. 3 of them, okay? We got it on video. They had black shirts, beanie caps, and then they had bandanas over their mouths. One of the suspects was a woman? Yeah.
The man behind the kiss turns out to be Chad Barnett, a local resident and regular customer at the Tap Inn. He says the whole scene unfolded in eerie silence.
They didn't even say a word. No one even screamed or, it was just super quiet. Everybody's just like...
And between the silence and the fact that he was very much into his makeout session, Chad admits that initially he was clueless.
We were just kind of into each other. I mean, what's wrong with that? I don't really know what was going on the other side of the bar. Obviously, I was busy and didn't really care.
But when he does look up, one of the robbers is right in front of him, and he's terrified.
He looked right at me, and I looked right at him, and I was like, oh, shoot, we're getting robbed. And the gal I was with, she kind of like buried her face in the side of my neck. She was super scared. She's like, what do I do? I'm like, I don't know, just don't make any sudden moves, don't do anything crazy.
Chad never says a word, but the thieves steal from him too.
He took my phone and the change that I left on the bar.
When the police arrive, Chad is cooperative.
The cops came in and obviously, they just questioned everybody. I was able to identify like 3 suspects. And then I pointed out to the cops, well, there probably had to be a 4th driver. They did actually review the footage and noticed that the driver didn't get out of their vehicle.
Billings has had a series of violent holdups, and police immediately suspect these are the same thieves.
Similarities in the cases started to emerge, such as one suspect hanging out near the doorway.
The lookout gal was the one standing by the door. She was the woman.
The common theme was that you had masked individuals that were fully covered. heavily armed, with bandanas over their faces. So a pattern began to emerge.
But rumors soon spread. Who are these robbers? And is this kissing couple as innocent as they seem? Why does Chad put his hand over his eyes at one point during the holdup?
A lot of people began to believe that because the kissing couple didn't react, that maybe they could be in on it.
These people could have been plants.
Well, new this morning, nothing can stop true love, or at least a good kiss. Not even armed robbers.
It doesn't take long for the video of the oblivious couple making out in the middle of a robbery to become a punchline.
It sounds like a joke. 3 gunmen walk into a bar.
This video went viral quickly, and someone mocking it, saying that love is blind.
Now, police say they are still looking for those suspects, but it's doubtful these eyewitnesses could really help them out.
The man in the video, Chad Barnett, is soon nicknamed the Tap-In Smoocher.
I'm like, well, this is going to get crazy really quick.
And Chad is right.
The very next morning, my buddy called me and he said, you know, you're on video at the Tap-In. I said, well, how do you know? And he's like, well, dude, you're at the Tap-In every weekend. Dude, it's your gray hat and it's just you.
As the video goes viral, rumors swirl about what Chad was really doing in the bar that night, and he's forced to speak up.
I had to clear my name because some people were saying that I was involved, and being out how calm I was, thought that I had something to do with it.
Some are speculating these two were pretending to be so intimate. These people were there as a distraction, to distract the bartender. Meanwhile, they know exactly what's going on.
But Chad strongly denies that and says it really is as innocent as it looks. It all begins as a low-key Sunday night out with friends at another bar. But then, Chad runs into someone he hasn't seen in years.
The gal there that I knew from way back in the day, we went to the Tap-In, and her and I just kind of hit it off, and obviously you saw the video. I was definitely into her and definitely inebriated.
She shies away from the media and manages to maintain her privacy, but they both strongly insist that the rumors are ridiculous.
People like drama.
Chad says people are making way too much of the whole thing, especially the part where it looks like he is covering his face.
Honestly, I don't remember really doing that. It was just probably a reaction at the time. It's probably like, oh my gosh, we're getting robbed.
And despite the rumors, police say the kissing couple were never suspects, pointing out that the couple did eventually react to the robbery.
It took about 10 seconds once this gentleman saw the guy grab his cell phone. Something was going on here.
And experts say the couple's calm response is actually smart.
Most of the time, it's very wise to not agitate the situation because attention could cause further violence.
If you can remain calm, that does tend to de-escalate that situation. The more you get them upset, especially if they're armed, this could have gone really bad. People could have been injured or even killed.
As for who was really behind the robbery, it turns out that within a 2-week period, there are 4 similar violent holdups in the area.
The Tap-In robbery was number 3 of 4 robberies, the 4th robbery being at a convenience store where the suspect actually discharged a round from a handgun and shot a cell phone right out of the clerk's hand.
And their motive seems to be the same.
Investigators soon believed that drug addiction, specifically methamphetamine addiction, played a role in these robberies. Robberies like this, where cash is what the robbers seek, is very common in cases involving those in addiction because they don't want to take the time to sell stolen merchandise. They need the cash now.
If they wanted to hurt somebody, they probably would have came in screaming. I think they just wanted to come in and get the cash.
Police believe the suspects have fled the Billings area, but they're confident they know who they are.
While investigators had developed a pretty good grasp of who was responsible for these robberies and identified a possible suspect vehicle and cell phone data, they still don't have that final piece of the puzzle enough to get an arrest warrant.
As for Chad, he says it's a night he and his kissing partner will never forget.
We're still good friends. And we laugh about it. Our little inside joke. Not thinking of myself as a tap-in smoocher. It's still kind of funny.
But they also realize how lucky they are.
I was obviously a little naive and probably a little more inebriated than I should have been. I look back and I think it could have definitely been worse. It probably scares me more now because I probably should have been paying more attention.
It begins with a sound no one remembers hearing, but everyone remembers feeling. The sudden absence of noise, the kind that presses against the ears at 3 in the morning. When a house should be breathing but isn't. When the refrigerator hum feels too loud, and the walls seem to lean in. Listening, and somewhere in suburban Northern California, in the summer of 1996, a light stayed on all night in a bedroom that was never slept in again. By sunrise, the word had already spread, not through headlines, not through police radios, but through curtains parting and doors opening just an inch, neighbors speaking in half sentences, lowering their voices instinctively as if the missing might hear them, as if saying her name too loudly could make the truth permanent. A young woman had vanished. No struggle, no scream, no blood, just a car still warm in the driveway, keys on the counter, a purse left behind like a mistake that could still be corrected if someone hurried enough. This was not supposed to be the kind of town where people disappeared. This was a place of trimmed hedges and weekend barbecues, of high school football games and church bake sales, of streets that curved gently and ended exactly where they were meant to. When detectives arrived, they walked slowly, because there was nothing chasing them, no active threat they could see. Only the quiet dread that settles when a normal life stops mid-sentence. Inside the house, everything looked paused. A glass half full of water. A television switched off but still warm. Shoes by the door, neatly placed, as if she had intended to return in minutes. The bedroom window was locked. The back gate latched. No forced entry. No obvious exit. And yet she was gone, as completely as if the night itself had taken her. Police wrote it down as a missing persons case at first, the way they always do because hope requires paperwork. They asked the family the same questions they had asked 100 times before in other towns, other years. Was she seeing anyone? Was she upset? Did she mention leaving? Did she have enemies? Each answer landed with the same dull weight. No, 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 no. By the second day, the tone shifted. Patrol cars multiplied. Detectives stopped smiling politely. The house became a scene, then a memory. Yellow tape cut the street in half, and suddenly this quiet California neighborhood was learning a new vocabulary. Cold case, person of interest, timeline discrepancy. The media arrived next, their vans lining the curb like a second, louder police presence. Cameras pointed at doors that would never open wide enough to satisfy them. Friends described her in clean, careful phrases. Responsible, kind, predictable. Words that felt safe until they didn't. Because predictable people do not vanish without explanation. Responsible people do not leave behind the small things that matter. And yet the facts refused to cooperate with logic. Investigators worked the clock backward. The last phone call. The last sighting. A gas station receipt timestamped just before midnight. A neighbor who thought they heard a car door, maybe, or maybe it was the wind. A dog that barked once and then went quiet. Pieces of a night that would soon be replayed so often it lost its original shape, smoothed down by repetition and doubt. Search teams combed fields and drainage ditches under a sun that felt too bright for what they were looking for. Helicopters traced slow circles overhead, their shadows sliding across lawns where children had stopped playing. Volunteers arrived in waves, holding printed flyers with a smiling photo that already felt like it belonged to another era. Each hour that passed without an answer changed the case, shifting it from urgency to uncertainty, from rescue to recovery, though no one said that part out loud yet. Then came the first strange detail. A partial footprint near the side yard, too faint to measure, too incomplete to classify. It could have been anyone's. It could have been no one's. It was photographed anyway, logged, filed, destined to become one of those artifacts investigators would argue about years later. Inside the house, forensic technicians moved with practiced patience, dusting surfaces that hadn't been touched since the night before. They collected fibers that clung stubbornly to a couch cushion. They swabbed a doorknob that showed no sign of a struggle. And in a quiet moment, almost as an afterthought, they took samples that would be boxed, labeled, and stored long before anyone truly understood what they might one day mean. In 1996, DNA was promised more than certainty, a word that sounded powerful in courtrooms and headlines but moved slowly in practice, limited by technology, by databases that were thin and fragmented. The samples were sent off anyway, disappearing into the bureaucratic machinery of justice, where time stretches and cases age in silence. Weeks passed, then months. The community adjusted in the way communities always do. Reluctantly, guiltily. Returning to routines while carrying a new awareness that safety was not guaranteed by familiarity. Porch lights stayed on longer. Doors locked earlier. Conversations changed tone when the sun went down. The investigation narrowed, then stalled. Leads came in, hundreds of them, each one demanding attention, each one dissolving under scrutiny. A man seen at a convenience store. Car that didn't belong. A rumor that traveled faster than truth and left nothing useful behind. Detectives followed every path until they ended in the same place. Nowhere. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, the case had acquired a name people whispered, cold case, though officially it wasn't there yet. Not officially. Not on paper. But in practice, the urgency had cooled, replaced by the slow, grinding persistence of a file that refused to close. The family learned a new kind of waiting, marked not by calendars but by phone calls that never came. They kept her room the same. They replayed memories for clues that might have been hiding in plain sight. They learned to live with two realities at once, the hope that she might still be alive, and the fear that the truth, whatever it was, would be worse. Years would pass like this, evidence aging quietly in storage, witnesses moving away, forgetting details, or remembering them differently, detectives retiring, handing the case to others who would read the file like a ghost story written by strangers. And somewhere in a lab, a genetic profile would sit incomplete, anonymous, waiting for a match that did not yet exist. This is how cold cases begin. Not with a single dramatic failure, but with a gradual slipping, a story that refuses to resolve itself, leaving behind a question mark that grows heavier with time. And in California, in a house where a light once stayed on all night, the silence never really left. Just learned how to blend in. By the time the search officially scaled down, the town had already learned how to look at itself differently, as if every familiar street now carried a second map layered beneath it, one only visible after dark, one marked by questions instead of addresses. Detectives returned to the house again, not because anything new had appeared, but because absence itself can be evidence when examined long enough, and they moved through the rooms with slower steps now, less hope, more suspicion. Replaying the night in their heads like a damaged tape that never quite reached the end. They focused on the timeline because timelines feel solid when everything else dissolves. She was last confirmed alive just before midnight. A short phone call. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of call people forget they ever made. Her car was found hours later untouched, parked exactly where it should have been. No signs of a rushed return, no indication she had been followed. The neighbors' statements were lined up side by side, their memories overlapping but never quite matching. Each one confident, each one flawed. Someone thought they heard footsteps. Someone else insisted the street was silent. Someone swore a car idled briefly at the corner. No one could agree on the color. Investigators knocked on doors again, then again after that, asking the same questions in different ways, hoping repetition might shake something loose. They studied the routines of the street, who walked their dog late, who worked night shifts, who kept odd hours that wouldn't raise suspicion because they were already part of the neighborhood's rhythm. Patterns emerged, then fell apart under scrutiny. Normality, it turned out, was an excellent disguise. Attention shifted to the people closest to her, not because evidence demanded it, but because proximity always draws gravity in cases like this. Friends, co-workers, former relationships that had ended quietly without drama, the way most dangerous stories begin. Alibis were checked, then checked again. Times were verified, then questioned. A receipt here. Time card there. Each explanation held just long enough to survive, leaving investigators with nothing solid to push against. Then came the anonymous tips, the kind that arrive like whispers through a wall. A man seen arguing with her weeks earlier. A vehicle spotted near the house on another night entirely. A name scribbled on a piece of paper, passed hand to hand, carrying the weight of suspicion without the burden of proof. Detectives chased each one, driving miles for conversations that ended with shrugs and apologies, witnesses retracting statements or admitting they weren't sure anymore, that maybe they'd heard it from someone else. The case began to attract a reputation. Not just tragic but strange. Too clean. Too quiet. No obvious motive. No ransom demand. No body. No confirmed crime scene. Just a woman erased between 1 minute and the next. Media coverage shifted tone, from urgent to speculative, anchors leaning into words like mystery and vanished, their voices dropping as if volume alone could summon answers. Behind the scenes, evidence was boxed and logged with care that bordered on reverence. Fibers, hair strands, skin cells lifted from places no one expected. Each item cataloged with the understanding that it might not speak now but could one day, when technology caught up with the questions. In 1996, that future felt distant, theoretical, the kind of promise investigators were trained not to rely on too heavily. As months turned into a year, the lead detective changed. Then another. Each new pair of eyes brought fresh skepticism and fresh frustration. They argued over theories late into the night, mapping scenarios that ranged from impulsive violence to calculated planning, from someone she trusted to a stranger who left no trace. Every theory worked until it didn't. Every suspect fit until one detail refused to align. The family felt the shift before anyone told them. Calls came less often. Updates grew vague. The language softened, careful not to promise anything it couldn't deliver. They were told the case was still active, still open, still being worked. They were not told how many others sat in the same filing cabinets, labeled the same way, waiting their turn in a system stretched thin by time. Community events began including her name in moments of silence. Candlelight vigils flickered against the dark, their flames reflecting in eyes that had learned how to grieve without closure. People spoke about her in the past tense, then corrected themselves, as if grammar itself might decide her fate. Someone painted a small wooden sign and placed it near the entrance of the street, a reminder that never quite blended in. Years passed. Children grew older. Houses changed hands. New families moved in, unaware at first of the history beneath their floors, until someone mentioned it casually, over a fence, lowering their voice out of habit. The story hardened into legend, retold with small changes, details shifting like sand, until even the truth seemed unsure of itself. Inside the evidence room, the case waited. The DNA profile, partial and incomplete, remained unmatched. Databases expanded slowly, names added one by one, each new entry a possibility that rarely paid off. Technicians ran comparisons when resources allowed, then filed the results away when nothing surfaced. No hit, no lead, just confirmation that the answer, if it existed, was still out there, unnamed. Every so often, something would stir the file back to life. A cold case unit formed, a journalist digging for a story, a retired detective unable to let go. They would reopen the boxes, reread the notes, trace the same steps through the same night, hoping distance might reveal what proximity had hidden. It never did. The frustration wasn't explosive. It was corrosive. A slow erosion of certainty that left behind questions sharp enough to cut. How could someone disappear so completely? How could a town full of witnesses see nothing at all? How could evidence exist without a story to anchor it? And beneath it all, the most unsettling possibility lingered, unspoken but ever present. That the person responsible had never left, that they had watched the search, followed the news, returned to their routines untouched, blending back into the same streets that had once felt safe. This is what made the case different. Not the absence of clues but the absence of noise. No dramatic turns. No violent discovery. Just a quiet void that refused to be filled. A mystery that aged alongside the people who remembered it, growing heavier with each passing year, pressing into the collective memory of a community that would never quite sleep the same way again. And somewhere, locked inside a system not yet capable of understanding it, a genetic signature waited, patient and indifferent to time, unaware that decades later it would be pulled back into the light, carrying with it the promise of resolution and the threat of a truth no one was prepared to face. Time did not move forward for the case so much as it spread outward, thinning its edges, blurring its center, until the original night existed only as a collection of angles no one could quite align. Detectives learned to read the file the way archaeologists read ruins, looking not for answers but for patterns of belief, tracing what earlier investigators had assumed, what they had dismissed, what they had circled in red and then quietly abandoned when nothing came of it. The margins were crowded with questions that felt almost accusatory now, written by hands that no longer worked the case, some that no longer worked at all. One detail began to attract renewed attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it refused to disappear. The phone call. Short, ordinary, placed just minutes before she vanished. At the time it had been logged and moved past, filed under routine. Now years later it was dragged back into the light, dissected for meaning it may never have had. Who initiated it? Where the call originated? Why it ended when it did? The person on the other end insisted it was nothing, a brief exchange, forgettable, but forgettable moments do not usually become fixed points in unresolved timelines. Investigators tracked down old phone records, degraded by time, incomplete, frustratingly vague. They interviewed the same people again, older now, their faces marked by years that had passed without answers. Memories had shifted, certainty softened. Statements that had once been delivered confidently were now hedged with pauses, qualifiers, admissions of doubt. Maybe it was later than they thought. Maybe earlier. Maybe they were confusing it with another night. The past, it turned out, was not a stable witness. Attention drifted back to the neighborhood, not as it was then, but as it had become. New residents answered the door, polite and curious, unaware they were standing in a place that had once been mapped inch by search teams. Some had heard the story in fragments, others not at all. When told, their reactions followed a familiar arc: disbelief, fascination, discomfort, before settling into something quieter, a private recalibration of what their street meant. Old neighbors, those who had been there from the beginning, were harder to read. They spoke carefully, measuring their words, aware now of how easily casual observations could be repurposed as suspicion. One admitted they had seen a figure near the house that night but hadn't thought it important. Another insisted they would have remembered something like that nothing unusual had happened at all. Their accounts overlapped just enough to be unsettling, never enough to be useful. Then there were the rumors that had never quite died. Stories that circulated just beneath the surface, too fragile to stand on their own, too persistent to ignore completely. A man with a temper. A relationship that wasn't as clean as it appeared. A disagreement overheard weeks earlier, magnified by hindsight into something ominous. Each rumor pointed in a direction and each direction ended in the same place. A lack of proof, a closed door, a suspect who remained just out of reach of formal accusation. The case file grew thicker, not with answers but with paper. New interviews stapled to old ones. Fresh theories layered on top of exhausted speculation. The DNA evidence remained the quiet center of it all, mentioned in meetings with a mix of hope and resignation. Technology was improving, they said. Databases were expanding. Someday maybe. Someday had a way of receding the closer they seemed to get. For the family, the passage of time sharpened rather than dulled the pain. They became experts in the language of investigation, fluent in terms they had never wanted to learn. They marked anniversaries not with celebration but with press conferences, standing before microphones to repeat the same plea, the same appeal to conscience, to memory, to whatever fragment of humanity might still exist in the person who knew what had happened. Each time they watched the crowd for a reaction that never came. Media interest flared and faded in cycles, reignited by arbitrary milestones. 10 years, 15, 20. Each one framed as a renewed push, a fresh look, even as the core mystery remained untouched. Documentaries were proposed, then abandoned. Articles were written that promised revelations and delivered only atmosphere. The case became a symbol, shorthand for unresolved loss, invoked whenever another disappearance needed context, its name spoken with a familiarity that felt undeserved. Inside law enforcement, the case earned a different reputation. Not unsolvable exactly, but resistant. A file that punished overconfidence. Detectives assigned to it learned quickly that it offered nothing easily, that every apparent lead dissolved under sustained pressure. Some believed the answer lay in plain sight, missed because it was too ordinary to stand out. Others suspected something more calculated. A crime executed with a level of control that suggested planning, patience, and luck in equal measure. One theory refused to go away, that she had known her abductor. That trust, or at least familiarity, had lowered her guard just enough. It explained the lack of struggle, the absence of forced entry, the clean break between presence and disappearance. It also narrowed the field to people who had been interviewed, cleared, and then quietly set aside, their names resting uneasily in the file, never fully erased. Yet every attempt to revive that angle ran into the same wall. No physical evidence connecting anyone specific to the act. No witness willing to step forward with something concrete. Just intuition, and intuition, however compelling, does not survive in court. Investigators circled the same names years apart, each time hoping distance might loosen a confession, that guilt might erode resolve. It never did. As the decades approached, the case crossed an invisible line. It was no longer just unsolved, it was historical. Evidence was retested not only for answers but to preserve it, to ensure it did not degrade beyond usefulness. The DNA sample was revisited again, run through updated systems, compared against a broader pool of profiles that simply had not existed before. Still nothing. No hit. No midnight call from a lab. Just another confirmation of absence. And yet, something about the case refused to settle into dormancy. Maybe it was the way it began with such complete normality. Maybe it was the way it ended or failed to end at all. Or maybe it was the quiet understanding shared by those closest to it, that somewhere along the line someone had known more than they said, had carried a piece of the truth forward into the future, waiting for the right moment or perhaps for no moment at all. Because cold cases do not fade the way other stories do. They sink. They embed themselves in the collective consciousness, resurfacing unexpectedly, triggered by a sound, a headline, a name that feels familiar for reasons no one can quite explain. And as this one settled deeper into the ground of California's memory, it carried with it an unspoken promise, that time alone does not absolve, that silence is not the same as innocence, and that answers, however delayed, have a way of demanding to be heard. The first real shift did not announce itself with sirens or press conferences. It arrived quietly, buried inside a procedural update that most people would never read, a technical adjustment in how old evidence could be re-examined, reinterpreted, and in rare cases, reintroduced into conversations long thought finished. For this case, it meant the DNA sample, the one that had waited in storage like a sealed confession, was eligible for another look, not because it had changed but because the world around it had. Technicians handled it with the careful reverence reserved for fragile things that might still matter. The profile was partial, degraded by time but no longer useless. New methods allowed analysts to extract more from less, to see patterns where earlier systems had seen only noise. The sample was run again. This time against a database that had grown exponentially, swollen by decades of arrests, voluntary submissions, and legislative shifts that widened the net. The result was not a match. Not yet. But it was closer than anything that had come before, a statistical proximity that suggested the profile belonged somewhere within the system's reach. Not lost, not foreign, just absent. For investigators, this was both encouraging and maddening. The answer felt near enough to touch, yet remained stubbornly intangible, like a shape seen through fog. Around the same time, the case attracted a new generation of detectives, men and women who had been children when the disappearance first made the news, if they had been alive at all. They approached the file without the emotional residue of earlier failures, less burdened by assumptions that had hardened into dogma over the years. They questioned everything, even details once considered settled, especially those. They re-examined the night from a different angle, not asking who had taken her, but how the act had been executed without leaving chaos behind. They studied the house again, its layout, its sightlines, its vulnerabilities. They walked the street at night, noting what could be seen, what disappeared into shadow, how sound traveled, how easily movement could be masked by routine noises. They realized how little disruption was required to remove someone from their life if the conditions were right. Witness statements were reopened, not for their content, but for their inconsistencies. The gaps between versions, the subtle shifts in emphasis, the way certain details grew sharper over time while others eroded. One neighbor's account, dismissed years earlier as unreliable, now seemed oddly specific. Another's, once treated as solid, began to wobble under closer scrutiny. Memory, they concluded, was not just fallible. It was strategic, shaped by fear, guilt, and the desire to appear helpful without becoming involved. The detectives also looked outward, beyond the neighborhood, mapping her routines across the wider landscape of her life. Where she worked, where she shopped, the road she took without thinking. They cross-referenced these with known offenders active in the region during that period, people whose movements had intersected with her world in ways no one had noticed at the time. The list was long, the overlap imperfect. But it introduced a new possibility, that the crime had been opportunistic, not personal, executed by someone who recognized a moment when no one was watching closely enough. This theory clashed with earlier assumptions, and the file began to feel divided against itself, older notes arguing silently with newer ones. The absence of violence suggested familiarity. The absence of motive suggested randomness. Both could not be true, and yet the evidence supported each just enough to keep them alive. The case existed in this tension, stretched between narratives that refused to dominate. Public attention returned gradually, sparked by a brief mention in a regional paper, then amplified by online forums where armchair detectives dissected every known detail with forensic enthusiasm and very little restraint. Names were floated, timelines reconstructed. Innocent people found themselves re-examined by strangers who mistook speculation for insight. Law enforcement watched from a distance, wary of interference but aware that pressure, however chaotic, sometimes shook loose what formal methods could not. The family participated cautiously, granting interviews that balanced hope with exhaustion. They spoke about her as a person, not a mystery, pushing back against the way unresolved cases tend to reduce victims to photographs and statistics. Still, they understood the utility of attention. The way silence had allowed the case to sink too deeply into obscurity. If noise was what it took to wake it again, they were willing to endure it. Inside the lab, the DNA profile was flagged for ongoing comparison, set to be checked automatically against new entries. It was a passive process, invisible, occurring without ceremony whenever a new sample entered the system. Most of the time, nothing happened. A silent comparison. A negative result. The system moved on. Then, years after the disappearance, long after most people had stopped expecting change, a notification appeared on a screen in the early hours of the morning, the kind of alert technicians are trained not to ignore. The match was not perfect. It wasn't even direct. It was a familial hit, a partial overlap suggesting a biological relationship rather than identity. A thread, not a rope. The name attached to it meant nothing to the case at first glance. A minor offender. Unrelated charges. A person who had lived an unremarkable life under the radar of serious investigation. But the genetic proximity placed them uncomfortably close to the long silent profile, close enough to demand attention. Investigators moved carefully. A familial match opens doors, but it also opens risks. Missteps could contaminate evidence, tip off a suspect, collapse a case already fragile from decades of waiting. They began building a family tree, mapping relationships backward and outward, tracing branches that extended into the years around 1996, into the geography of California at the time. Names emerged. Addresses. Employment histories. One branch of the tree led back toward the region where the disappearance had occurred, intersecting with the victim's world in ways that felt, at first, coincidental. Then less so. A job site near her route home. A temporary residence within driving distance. A gap in records that coincided too neatly with the night she vanished. It was not enough. Not yet. But for the first time in decades, the case had momentum that did not rely on memory or rumor. It had something that could be tested, challenged, confirmed, or destroyed. Something that pointed forward instead of back. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as detectives weighed their next move, the case shifted again, subtly but unmistakably, from an exercise in endurance to a test of precision. Because if they were wrong now, they might never get another chance. And if they were right, the silence that had protected someone for so long was about to break. They did not rush. That was the first rule. Cold cases reward patience and punish haste, and this one had waited long enough to demand restraint. Detectives treated the familial DNA hit like a live wire, something that could illuminate the room or burn it down depending on how it was handled. They verified it again, then again. Different analysts, different methods. The same result each time. A genetic echo, distant but undeniable, pointing toward a family that had never appeared in the file before. The name attached to the initial hit stayed deliberately unspoken outside a small circle. There would be no leaks, no premature headlines, not yet. Instead, investigators built quietly, layering facts until speculation had no oxygen left. They traced siblings, cousins, parents, children. They looked for anyone who would have been the right age in 1996, physically capable, geographically plausible. The tree narrowed slowly, branches cut back by alibis, by prison records, by proof of absence. One name remained. Not prominent, not infamous, the kind of person who rarely draws attention, whose life leaves only shallow impressions on official records. He had lived in California in the mid-90s. He had moved frequently. Temporary jobs. Short leases. A pattern that could be interpreted as instability or simply anonymity, depending on how hard you looked. There was nothing in his history that screamed violence. There rarely is. Detectives reconstructed his movements using fragments. Employment files, utility records, old addresses pulled from archived databases. They overlaid these with the victim's routines, her routes, her schedules. The overlaps were subtle, but they existed. A workplace within minutes of her commute. A stretch of road they both used without knowing it. A period when he lived close enough to notice patterns, close enough to learn when no one was watching closely. Still, suspicion alone was worthless. They needed proximity, opportunity, a reason, even if that reason was nothing more than chance meeting intent. They began quietly interviewing people from his past, careful to frame their questions broadly, never mentioning the case outright. Old coworkers described him as quiet, unremarkable, forgettable. A neighbor remembered a man who kept odd hours, but then admitted that described half the building. Nothing stuck. Nothing confessed. What unsettled investigators wasn't what people said. It was what they couldn't remember. The gaps. The way his presence seemed to dissolve when pressed for detail, as if he had passed through other lives without leaving fingerprints. That kind of invisibility is not criminal in itself, but it is useful. The next step required a decision that carried weight. To move forward, they would need his DNA directly. Not a familial approximation. Not a statistical suggestion. A definitive comparison. That meant surveillance. Patience again. Waiting for a lawful opportunity, something discarded, something abandoned, something that could be collected without intrusion. They watched from a distance. Not dramatically. No cars idling outside his house. No trench coats. Just quiet observation woven into routine. He lived a modest life now, far from the neighborhood where the case had begun. He went to work. He bought groceries. He spoke to no one for long. There was nothing about his present that betrayed his past, if his past held anything worth betraying. The first opportunity came and went. Then another. Each time, the risk of contamination or challenge outweighed the benefit. They waited. Cold cases teach you how to wait. When the sample finally came, it was unremarkable. A discarded item. Something that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. It was logged, sealed, transported with the same care that had preserved the original evidence for decades. The comparison did not happen immediately. It never does. Bureaucracy moves at its own pace, indifferent to anticipation. While they waited, detectives prepared for both outcomes. If it matched, the case would explode into motion, decades of restraint giving way to urgency. If it didn't, they would be left with a question even heavier than before. How close could you come to the truth without touching it? The result arrived without drama. A report. A set of numbers. A conclusion stated in language that allowed no ambiguity. The DNA was a match. Not partial. Not familial. Exact. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. No celebration. No relief. Just the collective understanding that a line had been crossed, that the case had shifted irrevocably from mystery to accusation. Someone who had moved freely for decades now had a tether to a night that refused to stay buried. But DNA, however powerful, does not tell a story on its own. does not explain how, does not explain why. It places a person at the center of a question and demands the rest be proven. Investigators moved quickly now, not out of panic, but because time, which had once been their enemy, had become an accomplice to decay. Memories were fragile. Evidence was finite. They revisited every detail with new eyes. The lack of struggle, the absence of noise, the clean exit, all of it began to align around the possibility that this man had not forced anything, that he had exploited a moment, a hesitation, a door opened without fear. The theory of familiarity returned, not as personal connection, but as situational trust, the kind extended reflexively to someone who seems harmless enough. They prepared the warrant carefully, anticipating every challenge, every defense argument that decades of delay might invite. The arrest would not be public. Not yet. Midnight was chosen not for drama, but for containment, a time when mistakes are fewer and witnesses scarce. When they went to his door, the street was silent. Lights off. No signs of disturbance. The knock sounded louder than it should have. Inside, a life paused just as another had decades earlier. He did not resist. He did not ask why. He listened as his name was read, as the charge was spoken aloud for the first time in relation to this case. He said nothing that night that explained anything. Silence, it seemed, was a habit he had perfected. By morning, the news broke. Headlines collided with disbelief. A California 1996 cold case solved, they said. DNA hit leads to midnight arrest. Shock rippled through a community that had learned to live with uncertainty. Phones rang. Memories resurfaced. Relief and dread tangled together in equal measure. But beneath the noise, beneath the sense of resolution being sold to the public, investigators understood something the headlines did not. An arrest is not an ending. It is an opening. And in this case, the questions were far from finished. The morning after the arrest felt wrong in a way no one could quite articulate. Sunlight returned to the same streets it always had, but now it illuminated a headline that promised closure, a neat line drawn under a story that had refused to be contained for decades. Reporters spoke in the past tense. Commentators used the word solved, with confidence that felt rehearsed. And yet, inside the investigation rooms where the air still smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee, no one said that word out loud. Because DNA answers a question without explaining it. It places a person at a moment, ties flesh to fact, but it does not tell you what happened in the space between. It does not explain how a life was interrupted so cleanly, how a disappearance left behind no visible wound. And it certainly does not explain where she was now. Interrogations began carefully, structured less like an attack and more like an excavation. Detectives did not rush toward the night in 1996. They approached it sideways, circling through the suspect's life, his movements, his memories. They asked about jobs he barely remembered, apartments he had forgotten he lived in, routines that had once been automatic and were now indistinct. He answered in short sentences, factual, restrained, as if emotion itself were something he had learned to ration. When they finally mentioned her name, there was no visible reaction, no denial, no surprise, just a pause, slight but measurable, the kind that registers only when you are trained to look for it. He said he didn't know her, that he had never met her, that he could not explain the DNA. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. Silence filled the gaps he left behind. Investigators pushed gently, then harder, laying out timelines, locations, intersections that no longer looked coincidental when arranged side by side. He listened. He corrected minor details. He never corrected the central accusation because correcting it would require engaging with it, and engagement was something he avoided with discipline. Outside the interrogation room, the case fractured into parallel realities. For the public, it was a moment of vindication, proof that time does not protect the guilty. For the family, it was something more complicated. Relief laced with terror, hope colliding with the realization that answers, once uncovered, can hurt more than questions. They were told an arrest had been made, that progress was real, that justice was closer than it had ever been. They were not told what the suspect refused to say. Search efforts resumed, but they no longer felt hopeful. They felt procedural, grim, driven by obligation rather than belief. Investigators returned to old sites with new warrants, digging in places that had been searched before, now armed with the authority of probable cause. Soil was sifted, structures examined, empty spaces measured again. Nothing surfaced. No remains. No objects. Just the same stubborn absence that had defined the case from the beginning. Defense attorneys entered the story with practiced confidence, immediately reframing the narrative. DNA transfer, they suggested. Secondary contact. Contamination. They pointed to the decades-long gap as a wound the prosecution would struggle to close. Witness memories had faded. Evidence chains stretched thin. The very time that had preserved the DNA had eroded everything else. Inside court filings, the case looked suddenly fragile. The prosecution had a powerful anchor but little rope. No body. No confession. No eyewitness. Just a genetic link and a reconstruction of opportunity. They needed motive, or at least plausibility, something that would turn suspicion into certainty. They returned again to the idea of chance. Of a moment when paths crossed without intention. When familiarity was manufactured in seconds. Perhaps he had offered help. Perhaps he had asked for directions. Perhaps he had exploited a routine kindness. The absence of struggles supported it. So did the absence of noise. But theories, no matter how elegant, are not evidence. As hearings approached, the tone shifted again. Headlines grew cautious. Breakthrough replaced solved. Commentators debated the strength of DNA alone. Online forums erupted, some convinced of guilt, others of miscarriage. The case, once silent, now made noise from every direction, drowning out the stillness it had come from. The suspect remained expressionless throughout. He listened to the arguments as if they concerned someone else entirely. When asked again about the night in question, he repeated his denial with the same calm precision. He offered no alternate explanation. He did not try to convince. He simply refused to bend. Privately, detectives began to confront a possibility they had avoided. That even with the right person in custody, the story might never be complete. That the truth, whatever it was, might be fragmented beyond repair, scattered across years that no longer remembered themselves accurately. The family felt this too. Closure, it turned out, was not a switch that flipped with an arrest. It was a process, uneven and painful, marked by moments of certainty followed by doubt. They wanted answers, but they also wanted her back. And the second desire made the first feel cruelly insufficient. As the case edged toward trial, one question loomed larger than all the others, unspoken but unavoidable. If the DNA placed him there, if the opportunity aligned, if the silence held, then where was she? That question hung over everything, heavier than any charge, heavier than any verdict could ever be. And as the legal machinery moved forward, grinding slowly toward resolution, the case revealed its final cruelty, that solving a cold case does not always mean warming it. Sometimes it only exposes how cold it truly is. The closer the case moved toward trial, the more it seemed to pull backward, tugging everyone into the gravity of the past it had never resolved. Prosecutors refined their narrative, sanding it down to something that could survive cross-examination, something linear enough to make sense to people who had not lived with uncertainty for decades. Defense attorneys sharpened theirs in response, emphasizing absence as loudly as the state emphasized presence, turning every missing piece into an argument, every unanswered question into reasonable doubt. In preparation, detectives returned again to the oldest materials, not looking for new evidence, but for coherence. They spread photographs across tables, the edges curled with age, scenes frozen in a time when hope still existed. They reread reports written by people who had once believed they were close. They listened to tapes of interviews conducted when memories were fresh and fear was raw. In those early voices there was urgency. In the newer ones, caution. Time had changed not just what people remembered, but how willing they were to say it out loud. One detail resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. A sighting logged late in the investigation's first year, dismissed at the time as unreliable. A witness claimed to have seen a woman matching her description in a vehicle near the edge of town in the early hours of the morning. The statement had been vague, the vehicle description incomplete, the direction uncertain. It had been filed, then buried under more concrete leads that ultimately went nowhere. Now, with a suspect in custody, the sighting took on new weight. Investigators tracked down the witness, older now, hesitant, their confidence eroded by years of being told they were probably mistaken. They reaffirmed what they could, admitting what they couldn't. Yes, they said it could have been her. Yes, they remembered the fear, the way the moment had lodged in their mind because it felt wrong. No, they could not be sure anymore. Certainty had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of doubt that cut both ways. Search parameters were adjusted again, expanding outward along routes that matched the witness's recollection, however imperfect. Remote areas were scanned, old wells inspected, properties that had changed hands multiple times were revisited with fresh warrants. Each search carried the same emotional arc: anticipation, effort, disappointment, repeated so often it felt ritualistic. The land, indifferent, offered nothing. Inside the jail, the suspect maintained his silence. He declined opportunities to explain, to contextualize, to deny in ways that might have sounded human. His attorneys spoke for him, constructing arguments that relied on scientific complexity and procedural gaps. They suggested innocent explanations for the DNA, scenarios that sounded plausible in isolation and strained when stacked together, but plausibility is often enough in a courtroom built to protect against certainty. The prosecution attempted a different approach. They focused on behavior, on the years of movement, on the lack of roots, on the way he had slipped through communities without forming attachments. They argued that such patterns were not proof, but they were consistent with someone capable of vanishing another person without being noticed. The defense countered that consistency is not guilt, that many lives look the same when reduced to bullet points. Public opinion fractured. Some believed justice had finally arrived, that the long wait had been vindicated by science. Others questioned the strength of the case, wary of narratives built too heavily on a single piece of evidence. Online debates grew hostile, theories mutating faster than facts could restrain them. The victim's name trended periodically, stripped of context, repurposed as a talking point. The family withdrew from the noise as much as they could. They attended hearings. They listened. They tried to recognize the man accused of ending her life and found nothing familiar there. No flicker of recognition that might confirm their worst fears. They were caught between wanting him to be the answer and fearing that even if he was, the story would still end without the truth they needed most. As pretrial motions dragged on, the case lost momentum in the public eye, replaced by newer headlines, newer tragedies. Inside the system, however, it remained heavy, occupying calendars and minds with equal insistence. Every decision felt consequential. Every delay felt like another theft of something that could not be replaced. Then, quietly, another complication emerged. An internal review raised questions about the handling of the original DNA sample. Not contamination, not misconduct, but documentation gaps common in older cases, when standards were different and expectations lower. Nothing that invalidated the evidence outright. Nothing that erased the match. Just enough uncertainty to give the defense another angle, another way to fracture confidence. The prosecution adjusted again, bolstering chain of custody arguments, calling experts who spoke in careful language about probability and reliability. Science, they reminded the court, is not certainty. It is trust earned through repetition and rigor. The defense seized on that admission, reframing it as doubt. And through it all, the central absence remained. No remains. No confession. No narrative from the person who mattered most. The case felt suspended, balanced on the edge of resolution without tipping into it. As trial dates shifted and patience thinned, those closest to the investigation began to confront a truth that had hovered since the arrest. That even if a verdict came, even if a jury agreed on guilt or innocence, the core mystery might survive intact. That the night in 1996 might never give up its final secret. Cold cases promise answers. This one, it seemed, was preparing to deliver something else entirely. A lesson in limits, in how justice can move forward without ever fully looking back. The longer the silence held, the heavier it became, pressing down on everyone involved: investigators, witnesses, the family, even the town itself, because when a cold case reaches this stage, it stops being about discovery and starts being about endurance. About who can hold on to their version of the past when every new detail threatens to tear it apart. The suspect's health began to decline, a fact that sharpened the urgency, because time was no longer an abstract enemy. It was visible, measurable, ticking in medical reports and whispered updates, and investigators knew that if they waited too long, the case might end not with justice but with an obituary. They intensified interviews, revisiting those who had already spoken, testing consistency, pressing gently but firmly, and in that pressure cracks widened, one witness admitting they had lied about a date to protect themselves, another correcting a detail they glossed over years earlier. Not because they remembered better now, but because fear had loosened its grip. One man, a former co-worker of the suspect, finally admitted he'd covered for him in 1983, adjusting a time card, not thinking it mattered, not understanding the weight of that small act, and his confession rewrote part of the timeline, placing the suspect unaccounted for during a critical window. A window investigators had suspected existed, but couldn't prove until now. That admission rippled outward, forcing a re-examination of everything built on that alibi, and with it gone, the case felt different, heavier, more focused, as if the narrative had finally snapped into alignment. The suspect was confronted again, this time with less room to maneuver, and his responses grew clipped, frustration leaking through the careful language, and when asked directly where he was during that newly exposed gap, he deflected, criticized the investigation, accused others of lying. Anything but answering, and sometimes, avoidance speaks louder than denial. Prosecutors prepared for the possibility of charges, drafting arguments, identifying vulnerabilities, anticipating defenses built on the absence of physical evidence, on the unreliability of decades-old memories, on the idea that suspicion had snowballed into certainty without ever crossing the threshold of proof. They knew the defense would argue that the investigation had been contaminated by time, by media pressure, by a desire to solve something, anything, and that fear shaped witness testimony as much as truth did, and prosecutors had to be ready to counter that narrative with structure, with corroboration, with a story grounded not in emotion but in convergence. The family was warned that if charges came, the process would be brutal, that the past would be dissected publicly, that their loved one's life would become evidence, rumors replayed as facts, privacy stripped away, and still they nodded because after 40 years, exposure felt preferable to erasure. The community split further, support groups forming on both sides, debates flaring in local papers and online forums, some arguing that reopening old wounds served no purpose, others insisting that justice has no expiration date, and in that tension, the town relived 1983 in real time. Investigators pursued one final angle, the suspect's own words, statements made over decades to different people, recorded in notebooks and memories, and they cataloged them, looking for patterns, for themes, for slips that might reveal knowledge only the perpetrator would have. They found them, references to locations never publicly disclosed, comments about how quickly things could go wrong, how easy it was to make mistakes disappear, language that hinted at experience rather than imagination, and while none of it was a confession, together it painted a picture of familiarity with crime, with aftermath, with silence. The suspect's attorney pushed back hard, filing motions challenging the credibility of witnesses, accusing investigators of tunnel vision, and in private even some on the investigative team worried about that, worried that years of focus might have narrowed their perspective too much, but doubt, they reminded themselves, is not the same as error. As the file thickened, so did the sense that this case, regardless of outcome, would leave scars, that solving it wouldn't restore what was lost, wouldn't bring back the woman who vanished into a Florida night, but it might finally anchor her absence to accountability. Then came the moment investigators had been both hoping for and dreading. A sudden change in the suspect's behavior, calls made late at night, messages sent to estranged acquaintances, apologies that felt unprompted, and apologies, in the context of a cold case, are never meaningless. One recipient of those calls agreed to record the conversation, not as evidence of guilt but as evidence of state of mind, and listening to it, investigators heard exhaustion, fear, a man talking around something he could not bring himself to say, circling it, touching it, pulling back, and that hesitation felt closer to truth than any denial ever had. Still, the law demands more than feeling, more than intuition, and as prosecutors weighed the case, they faced the same question that has ended so many cold case investigations: is this enough to risk everything? Enough to stand in front of a jury and say with confidence that after 40 years, the truth has finally been found? The answer was not yet clear, but the window was closing, and everyone involved could feel it. The sense that whatever came next would define not just the case, but the legacy of the investigation itself. Because cold cases don't end quietly, they end with a choice to act or to wait, to risk failure or accept silence, and as Florida's heat pressed down once more, the decision loomed heavy and irreversible, promising either long-awaited justice or a new chapter of unanswered questions. When the trial finally began, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a narrowing. The story funneled into a room where words would be weighed more heavily than silence ever had been. The courtroom filled slowly, each seat occupied by someone carrying a private version of the case. Memory, belief, skepticism, all of them waiting to see which version would survive. The prosecution spoke first, careful and controlled, laying out a timeline that stretched across decades without buckling under its own weight. They described a young woman who vanished without warning, a community frozen in shock, an investigation that refused to die. They presented the DNA as the bridge between past and present, a thread that had endured where everything else had frayed. Not a miracle, they said, but persistence. Science catching up to patience. The defense followed with a different tone, calm but sharp, dismantling the idea of inevitability. They reminded the jury of what was missing, repeating the word until it became its own argument. No body, no eyewitness, no confession. They framed the DNA not as a revelation, but as a question, one that required context the state could not provide. In a case built on absence, they suggested certainty was a luxury no one could afford. Witnesses took the stand one by one, carrying the weight of years on their shoulders. Detectives spoke about process, about decisions made with the information they had at the time. Experts explained genetics in language simplified for understanding, but precise enough to withstand challenge. The familial match, the direct comparison, the statistical odds, all of it laid bare, stripped of mystique, reduced to numbers that felt both definitive and abstract. The family listened, their grief transformed into something public, something measured in minutes and objections. They heard her name spoken by strangers who had learned it from files and photographs. They watched the accused from across the room, searching for meaning in a face trained not to reveal it. They found none. The defense cross-examined relentlessly, pressing on chain of custody, on documentation gaps, on the long delay between collection and testing. They suggested alternate pathways for the DNA, scenarios where innocence and proximity could coexist. None of the explanations were particularly convincing on their own, but together they created a fog, and fog in court can be enough. Outside the courtroom, the case became a spectacle again. Cameras waited. Commentators analyzed body language. Online discussions devolved into certainty masquerading as insight. The story escaped its boundaries, reshaped by people who would never feel its consequences. Inside, the trial moved forward methodically, indifferent to opinion. The prosecution attempted to humanize the absence, to remind the jury that the lack of remains did not erase a life or a crime. They spoke about trust, about how ordinary interactions can be weaponized, about how violence does not always announce itself. The defense responded by invoking caution, warning against narratives that filled gaps with imagination. They argued that time itself had contaminated the case, that memories had been rewritten by repetition, that evidence had been elevated by desperation. Justice, they insisted, must be protected from the desire to resolve. As closing arguments approached, tension settled into the room, heavy and unmistakable. Both sides knew what they had. Both knew what they lacked. The jury, isolated from the noise outside, prepared to retreat into deliberation with nothing but conflicting stories and a responsibility no one envies. When the jury left the room, the waiting began again. Not the endless waiting of decades, but a concentrated version. Hours stretched thin by anticipation. The family held hands. Reporters checked their phones. The accused sat motionless, eyes forward, as if verdicts were weather, something to be endured rather than engaged. The verdict, when it came, landed without drama. Words spoken evenly, almost gently, as if volume could soften their impact. The courtroom absorbed them in silence. For some, it was confirmation. For others, a rupture. The case, it seemed, had reached a conclusion that satisfied no one completely. Guilty or not guilty, the distinction mattered profoundly in law, but emotionally, it left the same residue. Questions remained. The absence remained. The night in 1996 remained unaccounted for in its most essential detail. As people filed out, reactions fractured along familiar lines. Relief, anger, disbelief, a sense that something vital had been addressed and something equally vital had been missed. The headlines that followed would choose their angle, but beneath them all lay the same uncomfortable truth. The trial had answered the narrow question of responsibility, but it had not answered the larger one of fate. It had assigned blame without delivering clarity. And as the case retreated once more into memory, transformed by verdict into history, it left behind a silence that felt eerily familiar, the same silence that had filled a house in California all those years ago, waiting for someone who never came home. After the verdict, the noise faded faster than anyone expected. Cameras packed up. Analysts moved on. The case, once again, slipped from the front pages into the quieter, less certain space where unresolved stories tend to live. Officially, something had been decided. Unofficially, nothing felt finished. The community exhaled, not in relief but in exhaustion, the kind that follows a long vigil when the light finally goes out and you realize you are still awake. For the family, the days that followed blurred together. Sympathy arrived in carefully worded messages. Strangers spoke about closure as if it were a tangible object, something that could be handed over now that the court had spoken. They nodded politely, thanked people, and returned to a private reality that had not changed in the ways that mattered. She was still gone. The space she left behind still refused to explain itself. Investigators closed their active files but not their thoughts. Cold cases rarely end cleanly for the people who carry them longest. They reviewed what had been gained and what had been lost, replaying decisions made years apart as if they had occurred in the same afternoon. Some believed the verdict was justice delayed but delivered. Others felt an unease they could not shake, a sense that the story had been compressed too tightly, forced into a shape it did not naturally want to take. The DNA evidence, now famous, was returned to storage, its journey complete. It had done what it could do. It had connected two moments separated by decades. It had spoken when nothing else would. But even its clarity had limits. It could not say when the contact occurred. Could not say why. Could not say what followed. Science had carried the case as far as it could, and then stopped, indifferent to the human need for narrative. The accused began a new chapter defined by confinement and appeals, his silence intact. He never offered a version of events, never hinted at explanation, never broke. Some interpreted this as defiance, others as emptiness. Those closest to the case understood it differently, as continuity. Silence had always been his most consistent behavior, from the night in question to the day judgment was passed. Rumors persisted because they always do when certainty feels incomplete. People revisited old theories with renewed intensity, searching for what the trial might have overlooked. Alternative suspects resurfaced in online discussions. Forgotten witnesses were elevated and reinterpreted. Each theory promised clarity and delivered only more questions, the same cycle repeating with different names attached. In the neighborhood where it had begun, life continued in its altered way. New residents learned the story eventually, usually from someone else, usually in a lowered voice. The house had changed hands, repainted, remodeled, made to look like somewhere nothing bad had ever happened. And yet, for those who knew, it remained a marker, a physical reminder that normality can fracture without warning. Anniversaries passed more quietly now. Fewer vigils, fewer speeches. The story had aged into something heavier, less performative. Those who remembered did so privately, in moments triggered by nothing in particular. A sound, a time of night, a light left on. The absence had integrated itself into the background of their lives, no longer shocking but never neutral. Within law enforcement circles, the case became a reference point, cited in trainings and discussions about the power and limitations of forensic science. It was used to illustrate progress, to warn against overconfidence, to remind new investigators that solving a case and understanding it are not the same thing. It lived on as a lesson rather than a resolution. And still, the most essential question remained untouched by verdict or appeal. Where was she? Searches had yielded nothing. Confessions had not come. The land held its silence. Without remains, the story could not fully settle into the past. It hovered instead, unresolved in a fundamental way, denying the rituals that allow grief to complete its cycle. For the family, hope transformed into something quieter and more complex. Not hope for rescue, not even hope for explanation, but hope that someday, somehow, the truth might surface in a form that mattered, that could anchor memory to reality. Until then, they lived with an ending that did not feel like one. Cold cases often end with answers. Some end with verdicts. This one ended with a question that refused to leave the room, lingering long after everyone else had gone. And in that lingering, it revealed its final cruelty, that time can move forward, justice can act, headlines can declare victory, and still, the heart of the mystery can remain exactly where it started, suspended in the silence of a night that never finished telling its story. Years after the verdict, the case resurfaced in quieter, more unsettling ways, not through headlines but through footnotes, through late-night conversations among investigators who could not quite let it rest. Appeals were filed and denied, motions argued in language stripped of emotion, each one reinforcing the legal finality of a story that still felt emotionally unresolved. The system had done what it was designed to do. Whether that was enough remained an open question. New technologies emerged again, as they always do, promising sharper clarity, deeper insight, another chance to interrogate the past. Old evidence was audited once more, not because anyone expected revelation, but because ignoring the possibility felt irresponsible. The boxes were opened, the labels reread, the samples re-examined under standards that would have seemed impossible in 1996. Each test confirmed what was already known and revealed nothing new. The absence held. Outside official channels, interest flickered back to life in unexpected corners. A podcast dedicated an entire season to the case, its hosts speaking in hushed tones about timelines and suspects, about justice delayed and truth denied. Listeners wrote in with theories formed from fragments, from intuition, from the irresistible urge to participate in an unfinished story. Some tips reached law enforcement, earnest but unhelpful, echoes of earlier decades repeating themselves in digital form. The family listened to none of it. They had learned that speculation, no matter how sympathetic, extracted a cost. Each retelling rearranged their memories, threatened to overwrite the person she had been with the mystery she had become. They guarded what remained of her fiercely, choosing silence where others chose analysis. In the prison where the convicted man now lived out his sentence, time moved differently. Days stacked on days with mechanical precision. He spoke rarely, declined interviews, rejected opportunities to explain himself even when nothing remained to lose. Those who interacted with him described a man unchanged by consequence, as if the verdict had merely formalized a separation from the world he had already practiced for decades. Investigators sometimes wondered if he would talk eventually, if age or illness might loosen the grip of whatever kept him silent. It happens, they told themselves. People confess at the end. People want to be heard. But wanting is not universal, and remorse is not guaranteed. Silence in some lives is not a strategy. It is a state. Meanwhile, the places connected to the case continued to evolve. Roads were widened. Lots redeveloped. Empty spaces filled in. Any trace that might once have existed was buried beneath progress, sealed under layers of concrete and indifference. Even if someone spoke now, finding corroboration would be a race against geography as much as time. The case file remained accessible, technically closed but never discarded. Occasionally, a new investigator would read it for the first time, encountering the story without the fatigue of history. They would feel the same pull, the same discomfort, the same sense that something essential hovered just out of reach. And then they would move on, pulled by the gravity of cases that still had a chance to be saved in real time. For the community, the story softened into something almost abstract. New tragedies took its place in conversation. Fear recalibrated itself around fresher wounds. Yet, every so often, someone would remember, prompted by nothing more than the time of night or the way silence settled in a familiar room. The case lingered like a scar that no longer hurt but never disappeared. Cold cases are often described as unfinished. This one was something else. It was concluded in structure but incomplete in substance. A narrative with a legally sanctioned ending, and an emotionally inaccessible middle. It challenged the idea that justice and understanding are interchangeable, that solving a case means knowing it. As years continued to stack, the possibility of a final revelation dimmed, not extinguished but distant, like a light left on in a house no one visited anymore. If the truth was still intact, it was locked behind a silence that had already proven itself durable. And so the case endured in its final form, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, not as a crime waiting to be punished, but as a reminder. A reminder that some stories resist completion, that answers can arrive without explanation, and that the deepest cold cases are not defined by what is unknown, but by what is known and still does not make sense. In the end, what remained was not the evidence, not the verdict, not even the unanswered questions stacked neatly in a file that would one day yellow at the edges. What remained was the echo of a moment, the precise instant when an ordinary night slipped its leash and never returned. The case had traveled decades, crossed technologies, outlived careers and assumptions, and still it circled back to that same point of rupture, the quiet hinge on which everything else turned. People spoke of it less now, but when they did, their voices lowered automatically, as if the story itself demanded respect. It had become a reference without explanation, a name that carried weight even when details were forgotten. Those who had lived through it felt it differently from those who had learned it later. For them it was not history, it was atmosphere. The house where it began no longer resembled its past. Walls had been repainted, windows replaced. The light that once stayed on all night had been swapped out for something more efficient, less forgiving. Yet for those who knew, the space still felt interrupted, like a sentence that ended too early. No renovation could erase that. The family learned to live alongside an answer that did not behave like one. They had a name now, a person held responsible. And still, they woke some mornings with the same question pressing at the edges of consciousness. Where did she go? What did she see? Did she understand what was happening before it was too late? These questions did not seek resolution anymore. They sought acknowledgement, a recognition that certainty has limits even when justice claims success. Investigators retired. Some carried the case with them into quieter lives, finding it resurfacing unexpectedly, in dreams and late-night thoughts, in the pause before sleep when unresolved stories like to reintroduce themselves. They wondered, privately, whether they had missed something small but decisive, whether another question, asked another way, might have cracked the silence. Those thoughts had no utility anymore. They existed only as residue. The convicted man aged behind walls designed to measure time in increments too small to matter. His silence remained intact to the end of each day, as reliable as it had been from the beginning. Whether it protected him, punished him, or simply reflected him was a question no one could answer from the outside. The truth, if it still existed in full, remained unspoken, its weight carried by a single mind that showed no sign of sharing it. Occasionally a tip still arrived. A letter. A phone call. Someone convinced they had remembered something important at last. Each was evaluated with professional care and emotional distance, the machinery of review turning even as hope resisted returning. None altered the story. None reopened the wound in a way that led to healing. Cold cases are often remembered for how they end. This one would be remembered for how it refused to. It challenged the expectation that time, science, and law inevitably converge on truth. It demonstrated that answers can arrive stripped of context, that accountability does not guarantee understanding, and that some silences are so complete they survive contact with everything designed to break them. And yet the case mattered. It mattered because it was pursued, because it was not abandoned to convenience, because it forced a confrontation with uncertainty rather than an escape from it. It reminded those who followed it, investigators, families, communities, that justice is not a single event, but a process shaped by persistence, humility, and the willingness to accept imperfection. In California, somewhere between memory and landscape, the night in 1996 still exists, untouched by verdict or headline. It lives in the spaces between what is known and what is felt, between the relief of an answer and the ache of what that answer cannot provide. The story does not close with resolution. It closes with recognition that some mysteries do not yield to time, that some truths remain locked behind human silence, and that even when a cold case is declared solved, the cold does not always lift. The silence returns as it always does, settling back into the shape it first took all those years ago, Not empty, not loud, but full of everything that was never said. Long after the last report was filed and the final citation entered the system, the case continued to exist in the margins of other stories, surfacing when no one expected it, a reference point for uncertainty itself. Detectives used it in quiet briefings, not as a lesson in success, but as a warning about assumptions, about the dangerous comfort of believing that closure and clarity are the same thing. They spoke its name the way sailors speak of reefs, not dramatic, just careful. Some nights, patrol officers driving the same stretches of road felt a strange familiarity they couldn't explain. The landscape had changed, the city louder, brighter, more crowded, yet something in the air still carried the residue of that first shock. It was as if the night remembered even when people tried not to. Streetlights hummed. Radios crackled. The ordinary rituals of law enforcement played out over ground that once held a secret too heavy to stay buried. In archives and databases, the case lived on as a sequence of numbers and scanned pages, stripped of emotion, reduced to searchable text. Yet every so often, someone reading it for the first time paused longer than necessary, caught by a sentence that felt incomplete, a detail that refused to sit still. They felt it then, the sense that something essential had been lost between the facts, something no technology was designed to retrieve. The community, largely unaware of its own collective memory, carried fragments without realizing it. A parent double-checking a locked door. A neighbor watching a passing car a second too long. A rule taught to children that had no clear origin but felt non-negotiable. Fear had reshaped itself into habit, into instinct, into something that no longer announced its source. There were anniversaries no one officially marked. Dates that came and went without ceremony, except for those who noticed the weight in the air when they arrived. On those days, time felt thinner, more permeable, as if the past could leak through if pressed hard enough. Nothing happened. And that somehow was the point. The story had become less about what occurred and more about what endured. The unanswered questions. The silence that outlasted inquiry. The uncomfortable truth that knowing who was responsible did not explain why or how or what was felt in the final moments. These were not failures of investigation. They were limits of access, boundaries no warrant could cross. Cold cases are set to haunt because they lack endings. This one haunted because it had one, and it wasn't enough. It exposed the gap between justice as a legal outcome and justice as a human need. A gap wide enough for doubt to live in comfortably. And still the pursuit had mattered. The waiting had mattered. The refusal to forget had mattered. Even now, even here, in the long aftermath where answers had stopped arriving, the act of remembering remained a form of resistance against erasure. Somewhere, the truth existed in its complete form once. It moved through a single night, through a single set of choices, through a sequence of moments that could no longer be replayed. Whether it would ever be spoken aloud no longer defined the case. What defined it was the way it reshaped everyone who touched it, leaving behind a quiet vigilance that never fully relaxed. The final sound is not a siren, not a gavel, not a confession. It is the low, persistent hum of a story that refuses to disappear, even when declared finished. A cold case solved on paper, unresolved in memory, continuing to breathe in the dark spaces where certainty fails and silence still holds its ground. Time did what it always does next, it normalized the unimaginable. The case stopped being a headline, stopped being a talking point, stopped being something people actively carried. It settled instead into the background noise of the city, absorbed into routines, folded into the rhythm of days that no longer paused to acknowledge it. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling transformation of all. Not forgetting but accommodation. New officers joined the force with no personal memory of 1996. To them, the case existed only as a file, a cautionary tale mentioned briefly during training, an example of how long truth can hide and how incomplete it can remain even when found. They listened respectfully, nodded at the right moments, then returned to the urgency of the present, where crimes were still warm and outcomes still undecided. The evidence rooms stayed quiet. Shelves held objects that no longer had a role to play. Items once touched with gloves and care, now reduced to inventory numbers and fading tags. Each object had once been a possible key. Now they were artifacts stripped of potential, preserved only to prove that everything possible had been done. The silence around the case was not empty. It was dense, layered with everything that had never been said, everything that could not be proven, everything that had slipped between moments of certainty. Silence like that doesn't fade. It compresses. It becomes harder, heavier, more permanent with time. For the family, grief evolved into something quieter but no less demanding. They learned the difference between moving on and moving forward, between acceptance and surrender. The case had given them an ending they could reference but not one they could inhabit. The absence remained, now framed by an official conclusion that never quite aligned with their internal reality. The community continued to function, continued to grow, continued to celebrate and mourn new events. But the case left behind a subtle recalibration of trust, a reminder that danger does not announce itself, that answers can take decades, that even certainty can arrive incomplete. These lessons were never spoken aloud. They were absorbed. Occasionally, someone would ask the question no one expected anymore. Why didn't he talk? Why didn't he explain? The answers, if offered at all, were unsatisfying. Some people do not explain themselves. Some truths are not performative. Some stories end not with revelation, but with refusal. Cold cases are often imagined as puzzles waiting for the right mind or the right technology. This one resisted that framing. It suggested something more unsettling, that even when the puzzle is assembled, the picture may still be wrong, or at least insufficient. That knowledge does not guarantee meaning. As the years pressed on, the emotional temperature of the case remained unchanged. Not hot, not resolved, just cold, preserved, suspended, a permanent state rather than a temporary condition. And so the story lingered, not as an open question, not as a solved equation, but as a boundary, the edge of what investigation can reach and what human silence can withstand. It stood as proof that some nights never truly end, that some cases are closed only in name, and that beneath every declaration of resolution, there can still be a depth of darkness that refuses to give anything back. Eventually, even the echoes began to fade, not because they were answered, but because the world learned how to live alongside them. The case no longer interrupted conversations. It hovered instead at the edges, a low-frequency presence that shaped reactions without demanding attention. People adjusted their lives around it the way cities adjust around fault lines, aware, cautious, never fully at ease. Those who had once chased every lead learned to recognize the difference between pursuit and obsession. They had followed the trail as far as it would go, pressed against the limits of evidence and law, and found only a wall of human silence on the other side. Letting go was not a decision. It was an erosion, a gradual acceptance that no further force could be applied without breaking something that mattered more. The story, when told at all, was told differently now. Less urgency, less anger, more distance. The sharp edges of outrage had worn down, replaced by a quiet disbelief that something so violent could leave behind so little certainty. The details blurred, but the feeling remained. That tightness in the chest, that sense of something unresolved pressing gently but persistently from the past. In classrooms and training rooms, the case became theoretical. A scenario, a discussion point. Students debated evidence chains and prosecutorial strategy, unaware of how much had been lost in the translation from lived experience to academic exercise. They spoke confidently about what they would have done differently, not realizing how thin the margin had been between knowing and guessing. The family watched time do what no verdict ever could. It dulled the sharpest pain without offering relief, softened memories without restoring what had been taken. They marked their lives in ways that no file could capture. Birthdays remembered privately, milestones observed with a quiet absence standing in for celebration. The case had given them a reference point but not a resolution. Cold cases are set to teach patience. This one taught endurance. It demanded the ability to hold conflicting truths at once, that justice had been served and that something essential was still missing, that answers existed and that understanding did not necessarily follow. It refused simplicity, resisted comfort, and punished anyone who tried to force meaning where none could be proven. The night of the crime continued to exist as a fixed point in time, untouched by the years that moved freely around it. Everything before it felt distant. Everything after it felt altered. That moment did not expand or contract. It simply remained, exact and unreachable, like a photograph that could never be developed further. Even now, decades later, the case had the power to quiet a room. Mention it and conversations slowed. People leaned in slightly, as if proximity might summon clarity. It never did. But the instinct remained, the hope that closeness might still matter. In the end, the case was less about what happened than about what followed. About the long shadow cast by a single night. About the way unanswered questions shape behavior more persistently than answered ones. About the truth that some stories do not conclude, they settle. And this one settled deep beneath records and rulings and recollections, into the collective memory of a place that learned, slowly and without ceremony, how to carry a solved cold case that never truly warmed. By the time the story reached this distance from its beginning, it no longer belonged to the moment that created it. It belonged to time itself. It had been reshaped by repetition, by silence, by the slow erosion of certainty that happens when answers arrive without explanations. What remained was not a question waiting to be solved, but a presence that refused to leave. The case no longer needed to be discussed to be felt. It existed in the pauses between words, in the instinctive glance over a shoulder, in the unspoken rule that some streets felt different after dark. These were not reactions taught or remembered consciously. They were inherited, passed quietly from one generation to the next, fear translated into habit. The official record stood firm. Names, dates, conclusions, all intact. On paper, the story ended cleanly, decisively, the way systems prefer. But real endings are rarely so cooperative. In reality, the edges frayed. The certainty thinned. The emotional arithmetic never quite balanced. Something had been closed, but something else had been left exposed. Those closest to the case learned to measure time differently. Not by years but by distance, how far they had traveled from the night it began, and how close it still felt when the world went quiet. They understood now that resolution is not an event. It is a negotiation. One that never truly concludes. The convicted man remained where the story placed him. A fixed point in an otherwise shifting narrative. His silence endured, unbroken, immune to pressure, speculation, or age. Whatever truth lived behind it stayed there, unshared, sealed off from the world that kept asking without receiving. That silence became the final artifact of the case, heavier than evidence, more enduring than memory. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time. This one proved something colder. That even when the ice breaks, even when movement resumes, the temperature does not always rise. Some stories thaw only enough to reveal their shape, not their substance. The city moved forward as cities do. New crimes, new names, new headlines replaced the old. But the case never fully disappeared. It lingered beneath progress, a reminder that certainty can be procedural, that justice can be partial, and that truth does not always arrive whole. In the quietest hours when the world narrowed to breath and thought, the case still asked its question. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. Not who did it. That had been answered. The question was simpler and far more difficult. Why did this happen? And why did the answer never come? There is no final image. No revelation. No closing sound. Just the steady continuation of time around a story that refused to dissolve into the past. A cold case solved in name, unresolved in meaning, carried forward not by investigation, but by memory. And as the silence settles one last time, it becomes clear that this is where the story was always heading. Not toward clarity, but toward recognition. That some truths remain unreachable, that some endings are only administrative, and that even when a cold case is declared solved, the cold can remain forever. Even after everything that could be said had been said, the case continued to exert a quiet pressure, as if meaning might still emerge if enough time were applied. It did not. Instead, it settled into permanence, a fixed presence that no longer asked to be resolved, only acknowledged. The story had crossed the threshold where answers stop being expected and start being remembered as something that once seemed possible. The language around it changed. Words like breakthrough and closure faded from use, replaced by softer, more cautious terms. Legacy, impact, aftermath. These were not words of victory. They were words of endurance. They reflected an understanding that the case had outlived its moment of action and entered something slower, heavier, more reflective. Those who encountered the case late, through articles or documentaries or second-hand retellings, often felt a delayed shock. They knew how it ended, at least officially, but they were unprepared for how incomplete that ending felt. They expected resolution and found instead a void shaped like certainty, an answer that explained responsibility without revealing motive, intent without meaning. The family carried on not because the case allowed it, but because life insisted. They learned that grief does not recede in a straight line. It circles. It returns. It softens and sharpens without warning. The case remained a constant reference point but no longer the center. Loss had expanded beyond it, into something broader and less definable. Law enforcement agencies cited the investigation as a success in technical terms. DNA databases had worked. Persistence had paid off. These statements were not untrue. They were simply incomplete. Success in this case had come without relief, without understanding, without the emotional resolution that the word implies. It forced an uncomfortable reckoning with what justice is designed to do, and what it cannot. Cold cases by definition imply time suspended. This one demonstrated something else entirely. Time had moved freely. It had advanced, innovated, improved. And still, it had not bridged the gap between evidence and explanation. The years had delivered an arrest, a conviction, a conclusion, but not comprehension. The story no longer needed to be told loudly. Its power existed in restraint, in the knowledge that not every crime yields a narrative arc that satisfies. Some leave behind only fragments, assembled into a shape that resembles an ending without fulfilling it. In quiet moments, those who remembered still felt the same unease. Not fear exactly, something more complex. A recognition of fragility. A reminder that certainty is often provisional, that understanding is not guaranteed, and that some human acts resist interpretation no matter how much time passes. The case had become a marker, not just of a crime but of a limit. A line beyond which investigation cannot travel without cooperation, without confession, without the voluntary surrender of truth. And when that surrender never comes, the line remains. There is no new revelation here. No last-minute confession. No hidden evidence surfacing from the past. The absence itself is the final fact. A silence that survived technology, scrutiny, and time. And so the story persists, not unfinished, not resolved, but settled into its final state. A cold case that was solved, recorded, archived, and yet never fully understood. A reminder that even when the machinery of justice completes its work, meaning is not always among the results. Even after everything that could be said had been said, the case continued to exert a quiet pressure, as if meaning might still emerge if enough time were applied. It did not. Instead, it settled into permanence, a fixed presence that no longer asked to be resolved, only acknowledged. The story had crossed the threshold where answers stop being expected and start being remembered as something that once seemed possible. The language around it changed. Words like breakthrough and closure faded from use, replaced by softer, more cautious terms. Legacy, impact, aftermath. These were not words of victory. They were words of endurance. They reflected an understanding that the case had outlived its moment of action and entered something slower, heavier, more reflective. Those who encountered the case late, through articles or documentaries or second-hand retellings, often felt a delayed shock. They knew how it ended, at least officially, but they were unprepared for how incomplete that ending felt. They expected resolution and found instead a void shaped like certainty, an answer that explained responsibility without revealing motive, intent without meaning. The family carried on not because the case allowed it but because life insisted. They learned that grief does not recede in a straight line. It circles. It returns. It softens and sharpens without warning. The case remained a constant reference point but no longer the center. Loss had expanded beyond it, into something broader and less definable. Law enforcement agencies cited the investigation as a success in technical terms. DNA databases had worked. Persistence had paid off. These statements were not untrue. They were simply incomplete. Success in this case had come without relief, without understanding, without the emotional resolution that the word implies. It forced an uncomfortable reckoning with what justice is designed to do, and what it cannot. Cold cases by definition imply time suspended. This one demonstrated something else entirely. Time had moved freely. It had advanced, innovated, improved. And still, it had not bridged the gap between evidence and explanation. The years had delivered an arrest, a conviction, a conclusion, but not comprehension. The story no longer needed to be told loudly. Its power existed in restraint, in the knowledge that not every crime yields a narrative arc that satisfies. Some leave behind only fragments, assembled into a shape that resembles an ending without fulfilling it. In quiet moments, those who remembered still felt the same unease. Not fear exactly, something more complex. A recognition of fragility. A reminder that certainty is often provisional, that understanding is not guaranteed, and that some human acts resist interpretation no matter how much time passes. The case had become a marker, not just of a crime but of a limit. A line beyond which investigation cannot travel without cooperation, without confession, without the voluntary surrender of truth. And when that surrender never comes, the line remains. There is no new revelation here. No last-minute confession. No hidden evidence surfacing from the past. The absence itself is the final fact. A silence that survived technology, scrutiny, and time. And so the story persists, not unfinished, not resolved, but settled into its final state. A cold case that was solved, recorded, archived, and yet never fully understood. A reminder that even when the machinery of justice completes its work, meaning is not always among the results.